Portico. The subterranean path, accessible on one side of the portico, allows one to reach the remains of the structures preceding the great 5th century basilica, which is still preserved today. In the middle of the last century, during some maintenance interventions, such as the restoration of the floor in the basilica and other interventions made necessary by the damaging consequences of the construction of Rome's underground Line B, the archaeological remains of the structures were found. Thanks to the archaeological excavations, evidence ranging from the Archaic period to approximately 400 AD were revealed. During the 20th century, the opportunity of excavating under San Pietro in Vincoli offered the chance to confirm the recurring theory that imagined the basilica rising from the remains of the ancient Prefectura Urbana, the organization responsible for the protection of the city, and therefore connected with the tradition of Peter's imprisonment. Western Crypto-Portico. We are under the portico of the basilica, inside the western branch of an imperial crypto-portico, perhaps of the Neronian period. The environment, once also situated underground, was illuminated by openings still visible on the top of the eastern wall. The so-called buchi di lupo, literally wolves' mouths, a sort of light well, were windows facing the large courtyard of a 1st century domus, placed in a garden and delimited on 3 sides by arcades with columns. A sequence of small rooms containing parts of the mosaic pavement, traces of frescoes, and several masonry shelves today represent the last known use of the structure, suggesting a commercial utilization. The access to the richest fulcrum of archaeological evidence is possible through an iron staircase situated on the eastern wall. Central nucleus, apsidal room. The space here is very tight, so much so as to partially limit access and make it difficult to observe the remains. We are near the centre of the Imperial Age garden, where a pool finely decorated with images of plants and animals recalling a marsh environment was originally situated. The greatest concentration of walls on the left is all that remains of the structures that sequentially occupied the garden from the 3rd to the 4th century AD. The first 3-nave basilica was built in 400 AD on the remains of a large apsidal room which eventually covered the pool. The excavation has not provided any indication of the function of the room. However, one hypothesis suggests it might have been used for Christian rituals. Republic and mosaics. Right below the surface of the garden dating from the Imperial Age, remains from the 2nd and 1st century BC of older houses have been found. On this side, portions of the ornate mosaic floors of one of the 2 late Republican domus are visible. The regularity of the evidence of destruction and some visible gaps on the floors, evidence of the removal of the emblemata, the most precious parts of the mosaics, are among the elements that document, even in this phase, an intentional demolition before the construction of the domus of the garden. Eastern Crypto-Portico. Here we are in the eastern branch of the Crypto-Portico, which we observe in the forms acquired with its function as funerary crypt. On the walls there is the presence of some lettering in charcoal from the 18th century with names of the deceased and the dates of their death. The walls in Opus Reticulatum and Opus Latertium of the ancient structure are visible on the opposite side of the altar. A last staircase leads to an area under the transept of the basilica in correspondence with the mausoleum of Julius II and the sacristy. Under the transept. In this area, under other late Republican mosaic floors, the most ancient testimonies have emerged. Rows of tough blocks covered with crude bricks, belonging to a domus with a foundation of volcanic substrate. The narrow extension of the excavation did not allow the reconstruction of the plan of the structure, which the archaeologists of the mid-20th century have dated to the Middle Republican Age, between the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. The construction technique and the presence of archaic ceramics, including fragments of bucchero, Etruscan pottery, have led others to assume that the domus may be even more antique than the rest. In this case, we would be close to the dates and the place, the hill of Fagutal, in which the ancient tradition located the private residence of King Tarquinio called the Superb. Like other homes of the nobility, the domus dominated the valley floor occupied by the commercial and residential district of the Suburra and the Forum, the political and sacral centre of the city. About 1,000 years separate the last historical evidence found under the basilica from the extant ones on the south side of the church. Mausoleum of Julius II. The doors on the sides of the monument connect the inside of the basilica with the sacristy, where for about 200 years, until the second half of the 19th century, the chains of Peter's imprisonment have been preserved. Through the right door, built in the last century, one enters the vast environment known as the anti-sacristy. Anti-sacristy. Today, the room, with walls about 6 meters high, appears to us in the form assumed in the Renaissance with the interventions of Francesco and Giuliano della Rovere, who became popes with the names of Sixtus IV and Julius II. The emblem of the family to which Sixtus IV and Julius II belong, two of the most famous protagonists of the political and artistic events of the Renaissance, is visible in the centre of the vault, the uprooted gold oak. The late 15th century floor, made of polychrome marble taken from ancient structures, perhaps the same upon which the church is erected, recalls a technique typical of the marble tradition called cosmatesque, frequently used in Rome until the beginning of the 1300s. Far from medieval experiences, however, are the shapes of the marble tiles and the pattern, woven with symbolic meanings, that now belong fully to the Renaissance. On the long side of the anti-sacristy, a door opens toward the room renovated in the early 16th century to conserve the chains. On the door we recognize the emblem of Cardinal Alessandro Cesarini, a bear chained to a column, surmounted by the imperial eagle. The door, still in its place after half a millennium, was donated by the cardinal in 1542, together with the first organ of the basilica. Sacristy. On the bottom wall of the adjoining room, an inscription indicates the intended use of this space, alluding to the holy relics. What is sacred to God here is conserved concealed. The date of 1523, however, does not correspond to the transfer of the chains. The interruption of the works of arrangement of the spaces for the new use as sacristy was correlated to the tragic sack of Rome in 1527. The chains would be placed in the display case in the centre of the wall only 150 years after the date indicated by the inscription, and would remain there until the second half of the 19th century. The refined decoration of grotesques that a recent restoration has restored in all its splendour is datable to the first phase of the works. They are attributed to Vincenzo Tamagni and Polidoro da Caravaggio. To the latter should be attributed some of the monochromatic frescoes on the walls of the room. While the grotesques recall classical motifs and imaginary settings, on the walls are represented events of the life of Peter and ecclesiastical symbols, in harmony with the sacred use of the place. The floor of the sacristy, with white and polychrome marbles taken from other structures, could date back to the years of the resumption of the works in the second half of the 17th century. In the small chapel that opens on the right wall of the sacristy, an altar of cosmatesque inspiration reuses ancient polychrome marbles and mosaic elements that perhaps belonged to a previous medieval altar. The Virgin with Child in the centre of the small altar dates back to the second half of the 15th century and was attributed to the sculptor Mino da Fiesole. Staircase. At the end of the first post-unification period, from the anti-sacristy one could enter the monastery and the extant Renaissance cloister, which serve at the seat of the engineering faculty of the university. The staircase flanks the 16th century door closed by a glass. Going up this staircase, you will arrive at a recently restored room. Room of the Flagellation. On the occasion of the consolidation works, traces of a large fresco have emerged on a wall, on which a scene of flagellation is recognized. The pattern of the representation is typical of a widespread figurative tradition between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, which has as its object an episode of the Passion and, more rarely, the final act of the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. Choir. A face of Christ inside a niche is all that remains today of the medieval frescoes that preceded the transformations of the Della Rovere family. We are in an environment perhaps conceived as a choir, a place from which sacred music could spread throughout the basilica during religious functions. On the opposite side of the transept are the choir and organ dating from the 17th century. Organ. The ornate gilded wooden choir was completed in 1687 as the frame of the organ built in the same year. It was made by the wood carver Lorenzo Barbieri and is one of the most representative examples of a tradition that developed in Rome in the second half of the 17th century. The original instrument was made by Giacomo Alari, a member of a family of organ builders active until the mid-19th century. With an important restoration completed in 2012, the organ once again returned to being played after a long period of abandonment lasting half a century.